The Bible refers to Jesus as the Son of Man far more frequently than it does as the Son of God. Yet many people insist on taking the title Son of God literally, while treating Son of Man metaphorically. This is a curious and inconsistent interpretation, and it raises significant questions about the true nature of these titles. The term Son of Man appears repeatedly throughout the New Testament. In fact, it is the most common way Jesus referred to himself. For example, in the Gospel of Matthew, he says, "The Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." In Luke, he speaks of the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. These phrases emphasize Jesus' humanity, his connection to the people, and his role as a servant and messenger. The term Son of Man was understood by the people of his time as a reference to a prophetic figure, deeply rooted in the traditions of earlier scriptures, including the Book of Daniel. It was never taken to imply divinity. On the other hand, the phrase Son of God is used much less frequently, and its context varies widely. In many instances, it appears to carry a metaphorical or symbolic meaning rather than a literal one. In the ancient Jewish tradition, the term Son of God was not exclusive to Jesus. It was a title often used to describe righteous individuals, prophets, or even entire groups of people who were considered close to God. For example, the Bible refers to Adam as the Son of God and speaks of Israel as God's firstborn son. King David is called God's son in the Psalms, where it says, "You are my son, today I have begotten you." Clearly, the term son here does not imply biological offspring, but instead denotes a special relationship of favor, closeness, and responsibility. When Christians argue that Jesus is the literal Son of God, they rely heavily on a selective reading of certain passages while overlooking others. For example, in the Gospel of John, Jesus is quoted as saying, "I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." This statement draws a clear parallel between Jesus' relationship with God and the relationship others have with God. He does not claim a unique status, but instead emphasizes a shared connection. Furthermore, Jesus consistently directed worship and devotion toward God, not himself. He prayed to God, sought guidance, and declared, "The Father is greater than I." These are not the words of someone claiming to be divine or uniquely God's Son. It is also worth noting that Jesus' disciples and followers did not treat him as a literal Son of God during his lifetime. They revered him as a teacher, a prophet, and a messenger, but their devotion was always directed toward God. The idea of Jesus as a divine figure, or literal offspring of God, emerged later, as theological debates shaped the doctrines of Christianity over centuries. Early Christians, particularly those in Jewish communities, would have found the notion of God having a literal son to be deeply troubling. The concept of God's oneness was central to their faith, and attributing human characteristics or relationships to God would have been seen as incompatible with that belief. Another point to consider is the historical and cultural context in which these titles were used. In ancient times, titles like Son of God were often applied to kings, leaders, or individuals of high status. The Roman emperors, for instance, were called Sons of God to emphasize their authority and divine favor. These were symbolic designations meant to elevate the individual's status, not literal descriptions of parentage. In this light, calling Jesus the Son of God could be understood as a way to honor his role as a spiritual leader without implying a biological relationship with God. The insistence on taking the title Son of God literally creates theological problems as well. It raises questions about the nature of God. If God is eternal and unchanging, how can he have a literal son? If God is all-powerful and self-sufficient, why would he need a son to fulfill his purpose? These questions highlight the inconsistencies in interpreting the phrase literally. They also underscore the importance of understanding these titles within their proper spiritual and metaphorical context. Additionally, the Gospel accounts themselves sometimes seem to contradict the idea of Jesus as a literal Son of God. For example, in Mark, when someone addresses Jesus as good teacher, he responds, "Why do you call me good? No one is good but God alone." This statement not only deflects divine status, but also directs attention back to God as the ultimate source of goodness and authority. Similarly, when Jesus performs miracles, he often attributes them to God's power, not his own. He says, "By myself I can do nothing. I judge only as I hear, and my judgment is just, for I seek not to please myself, but him who sent me." These words emphasize Jesus' role as a servant and messenger, fully reliant on God. Finally, the title Son of God must be understood in light of the broader scriptural narrative. Throughout the Bible, the emphasis is on worshipping God alone. The first commandment given to Moses declares, "You shall have no other gods before me." Jesus himself affirmed this when he was asked about the greatest commandment. He replied, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." His teachings consistently pointed people toward God, not toward himself. To elevate Jesus to the status of a literal son or equal to God goes against the very message he preached. In conclusion, the use of the title Son of God for Jesus is best understood as a metaphorical expression of his close relationship with God and his role as a spiritual leader. This interpretation is consistent with the biblical tradition, the context of Jesus' time, and the broader message of the scriptures. By focusing on the symbolic and spiritual meanings of these titles, we can better appreciate the message of devotion, humility, and worship that lies at the heart of Jesus' teachings.